My name is James. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe as steady. A husband, a professional, the dependable one, the guy who shows up on time, pays attention, and doesn't raise his voice. If you scrolled past my life online a few years ago, you probably would have thought I had things figured out. Clean photos, smiling faces, weekend trips, the quiet confidence of something that looked finished. But this story isn't about how things looked. It's about what happens when you live inside a life where your presence is assumed, but your absence is never considered. I've learned that people often underestimate men like me, not because we're weak, but because we're quiet. We don't announce our thoughts. We don't correct every slight. We don't perform our pain. That silence gets mistaken for compliance. Or worse, invisibility. And when that happens long enough, people start to behave as if you're not fully there. This is the story of my marriage. More specifically, it's the story behind a relationship that appeared perfect from the outside, while quietly unraveling on the inside. We looked perfect online, but we slept in separate rooms. And that wasn't a metaphor. It was logistics. It was routine. It was avoidance disguised as normalcy. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This is not a revenge story. There's no screaming match, no dramatic exposure, no moment where I suddenly become someone else. This is a documentary-style account of how emotional distance forms, how disrespect normalizes, and how clarity arrives, not with anger, but with stillness. Behind the photos and captions was a marriage already over, not because of one betrayal, not because of a single fight, but because of 1,000 small moments where one person stopped being seen and the other stopped noticing that absence mattered. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through who I was in that relationship, the role I was quietly assigned, and the moment I realized silence could either erase me or protect me. You'll hear about the choices I didn't announce, the preparations no one noticed, and the calm decisions that changed everything without ever raising the temperature in the room. There's no villain here in the cartoon sense, just two people moving at different speeds, under the illusion that stillness meant stability. I'm not sharing this to assign blame or to rewrite myself as the hero. I'm sharing it because I know how many people are living inside relationships that look fine, while feeling profoundly lonely. If you're listening to this, maybe you've been underestimated too. Maybe you've learned to stay quiet because it felt safer than explaining yourself for the 100th time. Or maybe you're on the other side, unaware of how close silence can be to departure. So before we begin, I'll ask you one gentle question. Have you ever realized something important was ending long before anyone else noticed? For a long time, I thought being reliable was the same thing as being loved. In my marriage, I was the steady background noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a clock, always there. Rarely noticed unless it stops. I handled logistics, calendars, finances, the quiet things that keep a life from falling apart. If something needed to be done, I did it before it became a conversation. I thought that was care. I thought that was a partnership. To her, and eventually to everyone else, I became the solid one, not the exciting one, not the difficult one, just the one who could be counted on to absorb inconvenience without complaint. At dinners with friends, I was the listener while others spoke. When plans were made, I was the flexible one. When disagreements surfaced, I was the one who softened the edges. I told myself that maturity looked like restraint, that love meant choosing peace over being right. And for a while, that felt true. Online, we looked perfect. The photos showed smiles, symmetry, and warm lighting. Captions about gratitude, growth, shared dreams. People commented things like, "You two are goals," or "Love how grounded you both seem." I'd like those comments, sometimes even believe them. What no one saw was that by then, we were already sleeping in separate rooms. At first, we called it practicality, different schedules, better sleep, temporary stress. It's amazing how easily distance can be explained away when you don't want to name it. 2 rooms became the norm became invisible, and eventually, so did I. I don't think she ever meant to erase me. That's the uncomfortable truth. It wasn't cruelty, it was assumption. She assumed I'd always be there, always adapt, always understand. And because I didn't protest, because I didn't dramatize my discomfort, The absence of my needs began to feel acceptable. In conversations, my opinions became optional, not dismissed outright, just bypassed. Decisions were made, then explained to me afterward, as if my role was to approve rather than participate. When I raised concerns, they were met with phrases like, "You're overthinking," or "It's not that serious," said gently, kindly even, which somehow made them land harder. I learned to smile through it. That's the thing about invisibility. It doesn't arrive all at once. It's incremental. A joke that lands at your expense and doesn't get corrected. A plan that changes without consulting you. A story retold where your contribution is quietly edited out. None of it was dramatic enough to justify confrontation. All of it is cumulative enough to reshape how you see yourself. I became useful. I stopped being essential. When friends described us, they talked about her energy, her ambition, her presence. I was supportive, grounded, low maintenance. Compliments that sounded positive but carried an unspoken message. You don't require much. And I let that narrative stand, because correcting it felt like asking for more than I was entitled to. Inside, something was slowly shrinking. I told myself this was adulthood. That passion mellowed into routine. That intimacy changed shape over time. I compared our marriage to louder, messier ones, and felt relieved we didn't fight. What I didn't realize was that silence can be just as destructive when it's one-sided. There were moments, small ones, where I sensed a shift in how I was perceived, like when she'd introduce me to someone new and summarize me in a sentence that felt incomplete, or when she'd make plans that assumed my availability without asking, or when she'd speak about her life and her goals as if I were adjacent, not integrated. Still, I stayed calm. Still, I stayed present. Because men like me are taught that patience is strength, that endurance is virtue, that being unbothered makes you respectable. No one teaches you the difference between quiet confidence and quiet erasure. I wasn't unhappy in a way that demanded action. I was just slowly disappearing. And the strangest part? No one around me seemed to notice. Not friends, not family, not even her. Because from the outside, I was exactly who I'd always been. Dependable, calm, uncomplicated. It took me a long time to understand that being seen isn't about volume. It's about presence being acknowledged. And somewhere along the way, I had become background furniture in my own life. At the time, I didn't know this was the beginning of the end. I just knew something felt uneven, like I was standing on ground that no longer pushed back when I leaned on it. And once you feel that, truly feel it, you never forget the moment it first became clear. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. No raised voices, no accusation, just a sentence said casually, in passing, that landed heavier than it should have. We were at a small dinner with friends. Nothing formal. The kind of evening where conversation floats between work, travel, and mild complaints about life. Someone asked a question about a decision we'd made together a few months earlier. Before I could answer, she spoke for both of us. She said, "Well, I decided it was the best move." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't pause, or check in, or soften it with "we." The conversation moved on immediately. No one noticed. Why would they? It sounded harmless. Confident, even. I smiled. I nodded. I let it go. But something inside me registered the shift. It wasn't that she took credit. It was the certainty with which she erased my presence from the story, as if my involvement had been incidental, as if my agreement had been assumed, not earned. I remember thinking, that's not how I remember it. And then, almost immediately, thinking, it's not worth correcting. That was the cut. Small enough to ignore, clean enough to rationalize, but precise. On the drive home, I considered bringing it up. I rehearsed the sentence in my head, neutral, non-accusatory, something like, "Hey, earlier tonight, when you said..." But I could already predict the response: confusion, surprise, a gentle laugh. "Oh my God, you're reading into it." And just like that, the burden would shift to me, for being sensitive, for disrupting the peace. So I stayed quiet. That decision felt mature at the time. It felt like choosing harmony over ego. But silence has a way of teaching people what they can get away with. And that night, without realizing it, I taught her that my version of events was optional. After that, it happened again. Not immediately. Weeks later, different context, same pattern, a story told without me in it, a decision framed as hers alone. Each time, subtle enough to dismiss. Each time, I noticed. What surprised me wasn't her behavior, it was mine. I started observing instead of participating, not in a cold way, more like curiosity. I paid attention to when my input was requested versus when it was assumed, when my agreement was sought versus when it was narrated after the fact. I didn't challenge it, I just logged it. I realized something uncomfortable. People often treat you the way you quietly train them to. And I had trained everyone around me to believe I didn't need acknowledgement. Friends didn't step in because there was nothing to step into, no tension, no visible discomfort, just a man nodding along. And because I didn't correct the record, the revised version became the official one. At home, the emotional distance widened in ways that were easy to misinterpret as busyness. Conversations became transactional, updates instead of exchanges. I'd share something about my day, and it would be met with half attention, followed by a pivot back to hers. Again, not malicious, just practiced. The separate rooms made this easier to ignore. Physical distance gives emotional neglect plausible deniability. You tell yourself it's a phase. That closeness will return when schedules calm down, when stress lifts, when something external changes. I clung to that idea longer than I should have. That first small cut didn't hurt because of its severity. It hurt because of what it revealed, that my presence could be removed from the narrative without consequence, that no one rushed to correct it, that I didn't either. And once that door opens, it never closes on its own. I wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly, I was thoughtful, aware in a way I hadn't been before, like noticing a hairline crack in a wall and suddenly seeing it everywhere. I began to understand that respect doesn't disappear loudly. It fades quietly, through moments everyone else forgets by morning. But I remembered that one, clearly. Because it was the first time I realized something important. Being calm doesn't protect you from being diminished. Sometimes it makes it easier. After the first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. That's what made it dangerous. Life continued. Work, routines, shared obligations. From the outside, we were still the same couple, functional, polite, composed. No one would have described us as struggling, and if you'd asked me then, I probably wouldn't have used that word either. I would have said we were busy or out of sync. Safer explanations, softer ones. But internally, I began adjusting. Each time my opinion was skipped over, I told myself it wasn't intentional. Each time a decision was framed as hers alone, I rationalized it as confidence. Each time a comment landed slightly dismissive, I assumed I was misreading the tone. I became very good at explaining away my own discomfort. That's how disrespect becomes normal, when the person receiving it does most of the work to make it feel reasonable. I noticed I started choosing my words more carefully, not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I'd pre-edit my thoughts before speaking, trimming anything that might slow things down or challenge momentum. Over time, that habit shrank my presence. I spoke less, not because I had less to say, but because it seemed unnecessary. She didn't ask where that silence came from. In group settings, the pattern solidified. If someone asked a question that involved both of us, my eyes went to her. I'd wait. Sometimes I'd be invited in. Often, I wouldn't. When I did speak, it was treated as supplementary, an add-on, not the core. No one was rude. That's the part people misunderstand. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just omission, a subtle recalibration of whose voice carries weight. And because I didn't push back, it kept happening. At home, the emotional tone flattened. Conversations became efficient, necessary. I found myself giving updates instead of sharing experiences. She'd listen just enough to respond, not enough to ask follow-up questions. I don't think she noticed the difference. Or maybe she did, and assumed I preferred it that way. I told myself that being low maintenance was a virtue. There's a strange pride in being the person who doesn't need much, who doesn't complain, who adapts. It feels like strength, like emotional maturity. But over time, it creates an imbalance. One person expands, the other contracts. And eventually, the space between them becomes the relationship. I remember one night, lying awake in my separate room, realizing I hadn't been asked a meaningful question in weeks. Not about my thoughts, not about my plans, not about how I felt. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost clinical. I wasn't being mistreated. I was being overlooked, and I was cooperating. That's the part that's hardest to admit. No one forced me into that role. I stepped into it willingly, believing it was temporary, believing it was noble, believing that if I stayed patient long enough, balance would return on its own. But balance doesn't restore itself without acknowledgement. The more I normalized the dismissal, the more it became invisible to her, to others, and eventually to me. I stopped expecting reciprocity. I stopped checking whether my needs were being met. I told myself I was fine, and because I looked fine, no one questioned it. That's how you disappear without leaving. There was no single moment when I felt disrespected enough to leave. Just a long series of moments that trained me to accept less than presence, less than a partnership, less than being seen. By the time I realized what was happening, it already felt normal, and that scared me more than anything else. Because when disrespect feels normal, you don't fight it, you adapt to it. I didn't realize I'd been given a role until I stopped trying to change it. That's when it became clear. In our marriage, I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed stress so it didn't spill outward. The emotional shock absorber. If something went wrong, I handled it quietly. If plans shifted, I adjusted. If she was overwhelmed, I made myself smaller so there'd be more room for her. At some point, that stopped being something I did and became who I was. The role was simple: be reliable, be agreeable, don't require attention. I wasn't expected to lead or follow, just to support, to exist in the background, ensuring the structure held while someone else occupied the center. And the most dangerous part, everyone agreed with that casting, including me. Friends praised me for being easygoing. My family admired my patience. Even she described me as solid and understanding. Words that sound like appreciation, but come with an expiration date. Because once someone decides you don't need much, they stop offering. I noticed that when I expressed uncertainty or discomfort, it disrupted the script. Not dramatically, but enough to cause friction. The room would go quiet for half a second too long. The energy would shift, and I'd feel the unspoken pressure to return to my role. So I did. I learned when to speak and when not to. I learned how to phrase concerns so they sounded like suggestions. I learned how to soften my own edges before anyone else had the chance to. Over time, I became predictable, dependable, safe, invisible. The separate rooms weren't a coincidence. They were a physical manifestation of the role I'd been assigned. Functional distance, no emotional friction, no need for intimacy, just two adults coexisting efficiently. From the outside, it looked mature. Internally, it felt like being slowly archived. What struck me most was how little resistance there was when I withdrew. When I spoke less, no one asked why. When I stopped initiating plans, they still happened, just without me at the center. When I went quiet emotionally, it was interpreted as contentment. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. My presence had become optional, not because I lacked value, but because I had trained everyone to believe I didn't need to be engaged with to remain stable. I was the constant, and constants get taken for granted. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening, listening to her talk about future plans, career moves, travel ideas, lifestyle changes. I noticed how rarely the word "we" came up, not deliberately excluded, just absent. And when I asked where I fit into that vision, the answer was vague, flexible. We'll figure it out. That sentence used to comfort me. Now it sounded like a placeholder. The role I was assigned didn't require me to have a future of my own, just availability. And that's when something in me stopped trying to earn space. Not out of resentment, out of clarity. I realized that no amount of quiet excellence would shift a role that benefited everyone else. As long as I remained useful without being visible, there was no incentive for the dynamic to change. And confronting it directly would only cast me as the problem, disruptive, needy, out of character. So I didn't confront it. I observed it. I began to see the role for what it was. A container designed to keep me steady, not fulfilled. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how much of your life is spent maintaining a version of yourself that others are comfortable with. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me still. And in that stillness, something began to shift, not outwardly, but internally. I stopped measuring my worth by how little I needed. I stopped assuming that being easy to live with was the same as being loved. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to ask before. What happens if I step out of this role quietly? The day everything shifted didn't look important at the time. There was no argument, no discovery, no moment where I suddenly saw her differently. It was an ordinary morning, quiet in the way that only routines can be. Coffee brewed, light filtered through the window. The house functioned exactly as it was supposed to, and that was the problem. I was standing in this hallway, holding a folded shirt I'd picked up from the floor. It wasn't mine. I paused, not because of the shirt, but because I realized I had no idea where to put it. Her room, the laundry, back where I found it. It was a small hesitation, almost nothing. But in that pause, something inside me settled into place. I realized I was navigating my own home the way a guest would, carefully, quietly, trying not to disturb the existing order. The thought arrived fully formed, without emotion attached. This is no longer my space. Not physically, emotionally. I wasn't angry, I wasn't hurt, I was clear. Clarity is different from realization. Realization still carries shock. Clarity feels calm, like a lens snapping into focus. You don't react, you adjust. I put the shirt down and went to make my coffee. As I stood there, I thought back over the last year, not searching for blame, just tracing patterns. How rarely we shared meals. How often were they communicated instead of discussed? How natural it had become for us to live parallel lives under the same roof. And I noticed something else. I had stopped missing her. That thought scared me more than anything else up to that point. Not because I wanted drama, but because indifference is honest in a way longing isn't. You can rationalize distance, you can explain fatigue, but you can't argue with the absence of desire to reconnect. That morning, when she passed me in the hallway, we exchanged polite words, functional, efficient, and I felt nothing, no tension, no warmth, just neutrality. That's when I knew the shift wasn't about her behavior anymore. It was about my internal state. Something in me had stopped trying to be seen. I went to work that day and noticed how different I felt in other environments. Engaged, curious, present. My voice carried weight in meetings. My opinions were sought out. I was respected, not because I demanded it, but because I occupied my space fully. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I wasn't invisible everywhere, only at home. And that meant the issue wasn't who I was. It was where I was placing my energy. By the time I returned that evening, the decision hadn't been made yet, but the direction had. I understood, with quiet certainty, that continuing as I was would require me to keep shrinking, and I wasn't willing to do that anymore. Not loudly, not dramatically, just internally. That was the day I stopped waiting for the relationship to correct itself. The day I stopped assuming that patience would eventually be rewarded. The day I accepted that sometimes staying calm doesn't mean staying still. Nothing changed externally that day. No one noticed a difference, and that was important, because the most significant shifts don't announce themselves. They prepare. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, automatic, a habit formed from years of smoothing edges and avoiding disruption. But now, it was deliberate, chosen, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. I didn't withdraw out of spite. I didn't sulk or punish. On the surface, I was the same, polite, functional, cooperative, but internally, I stopped offering parts of myself that were no longer being received. When you stop speaking to be heard and start speaking only when it matters, people rarely notice the shift. They assume you're still the same, and in my case, that assumption worked in my favor. I listened more than I talked, not passively, strategically. I paid attention to patterns I'd once ignored, how decisions were framed, how narratives were constructed, how my absence from certain conversations went unquestioned. Silence gave me perspective. I noticed how often she spoke about her life as something already in motion, with or without me. I noticed how little curiosity there was about my inner world, and I noticed how easily that lack of curiosity coexisted with comfort. People don't always pull away because they're unhappy. Sometimes they pull away because nothing is demanding their attention. My silence created space, not for reconnection, but for observation. I stopped volunteering explanations, stopped filling gaps. If something didn't involve me, I didn't insert myself. If a plan was made without me, I didn't adjust my schedule to accommodate it. Not confrontationally, just neutrally. No one commented on it. That confirmed something I'd suspected for a while. My flexibility had been doing more work than anyone realized, and once it was gone, the structure still held, just without me at the center. At night, in my separate room, I began thinking less about the relationship and more about myself. Not emotionally, logistically, practically. I asked questions I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. What did I want my days to look like? What did I value beyond stability? What would it mean to choose myself without needing permission? There was no rush, no panic, just quiet alignment. Silence, when chosen consciously, is powerful. It removes friction. It reveals the truth. It allows people to show you exactly how much space they're willing to make for you without being prompted. And what I saw was sobering. There was no sudden concern, no attempt to bridge the gap. The distance didn't alarm anyone because it had already been normalized. My quietness fit the role I'd been assigned. That's when I understood something essential. Waiting to be noticed was no longer an option. Not because I needed validation, but because clarity had replaced hope. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I wasn't strategizing outcomes. I was simply reclaiming my internal autonomy, deciding that my silence would no longer be a sign of endurance, but a signal to myself that I was paying attention. This wasn't withdrawal, it was preparation, and preparation by nature is invisible. What they never noticed was how much work I started doing in the quiet. From the outside, nothing changed. Same routines, same tone, same availability when required. But internally, I shifted into a different mode, one I hadn't used in years. Not emotional, analytical, observant, patient. I began documenting, not obsessively, not with resentment, but with clarity. I kept track of patterns, financial habits, communication gaps, assumptions that had been made on my behalf. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a clear picture of reality without the fog of hope or denial. When you stop trying to fix things emotionally, you start seeing them structurally. I reviewed our finances more closely than I had before, not because I suspected anything improper, but because I realized I'd been operating on trust without visibility. I noticed how responsibilities had been divided and how credit had been distributed. I noticed how often I carried the weight of long-term planning, while decisions were framed as individual achievements. I didn't react, I adjusted. I started learning again, quietly, reading about things I'd postponed for years. Personal finance structures, legal boundaries, emotional detachment without bitterness. I didn't talk about it. There was no reason to. Preparation doesn't need witnesses. At work, I sharpened my focus, took on projects that increased my autonomy, strengthened relationships that existed outside my marriage, not as an escape, but as reinforcement. I reminded myself who I was when I wasn't shrinking to fit a role. I paid attention to how often my contributions at home went unnoticed, and how easily that went unchallenged. That information mattered, not for judgment, but for calibration. It told me what level of presence was expected of me if nothing changed, and nothing did. That's the part people misunderstand when they imagine moments like this. They expect tension, suspicion, a sense that something is off. But when you've been invisible for long enough, your quiet preparation blends into the background. It looks consistent. She didn't notice that I stopped sharing long-term thoughts. Didn't notice that I stopped imagining futures out loud. Didn't notice that my patience had shifted from hope to strategy. And why would she? I was still reliable, still calm, still fulfilling the visible parts of my role. What they never noticed was that I was no longer emotionally invested in maintaining the illusion. I was investing in understanding the terrain, where I stood, what I controlled, and what I didn't. There was no bitterness in it, just focus. I learned the difference between peace and avoidance, between loyalty and inertia, between silence that protects a relationship and silence that protects you. By the time I finished preparing, mentally, practically, quietly, I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. I wasn't even waiting for change. I was waiting for alignment. And alignment doesn't announce itself. It waits. The reveal didn't come from her. It came from a document I almost didn't open. It was late, quiet in the house, in that familiar, hollow way. I was sitting at the small desk in my room, sorting through files I'd let pile up, statements, agreements, things I'd always handled, but rarely revisited with intention. This time, I wasn't multitasking. I wasn't tired. I was focused. And focus changes what you see. As I traced through the details, something became clear, not suddenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. I had more leverage than I realized, not in the sense of power over someone, but in terms of independence, options, agency. For years, I'd been operating under an outdated assumption that disentangling would be complicated, destabilizing, costly in every sense of the word. That staying was the responsible choice because leaving would create chaos. That belief had kept me still. But the reality, laid out plainly in numbers and structure, told a different story. I wasn't trapped. I had been choosing not to look. There was no rush of triumph. No relief, even. Just a deep, steady calm. The kind that comes when uncertainty dissolves into clarity. I understood, in that moment, that I could leave without imploding my life. That my stability wasn't dependent on her presence. That my future didn't require negotiation. It required a decision. I closed the file and sat back. This wasn't about winning, or exposing anything, or reclaiming dignity through confrontation. It was about knowing, privately, fully, that I had options. And once you know that, the dynamic shifts whether anyone else is aware of it or not. The marriage hadn't ended that night, but my dependence on its continuation did. I went to sleep without rehearsing conversations, without planning explanations, because explanations are for when you're still asking permission. I wasn't. The private reveal wasn't a secret I needed to share. It was simply the moment I stopped feeling uncertain about myself, the moment I realized that staying silent didn't mean staying powerless. It meant I was ready. Once you realize you have options, hesitation stops being neutral. It becomes a decision in itself. That was the space I entered. Not anxious, not dramatic, but deeply awake. The kind of awareness that doesn't argue with itself anymore. The kind that doesn't ask, how do I feel? But instead asks, what is true? I didn't talk to anyone about it. Not friends, not family, and certainly not her. The most important decisions of your life rarely benefit from witnesses. They need honesty, not validation. Night after night, I sat alone, not spiraling, not replaying fights, but calmly reviewing reality. I wasn't asking whether I still loved her. That question felt irrelevant. Love can survive imbalance far longer than dignity can. I asked a harder question. What is my actual position in this life? And the answer, once I allowed myself to see it, was unmistakable. I was living in a marriage where my presence was no longer essential, where my absence didn't create concern, where my silence fit so seamlessly into the system that no one felt compelled to check on it. I wasn't mistreated. I wasn't betrayed in a dramatic way. I was simply no longer centered, neither in her life nor in my own. That distinction matters, because there's a difference between being hurt and being displaced. I laid out the options carefully, without emotion coloring them. Option 1, stay. Staying didn't mean failure. Many people stay. Staying meant preserving stability, routine, and social coherence. It meant continuing to be dependable, low friction, and quietly accommodating. There is comfort in that path. Society rewards it. No one questions it. But I knew the cost. Staying meant continuing to compress myself to maintain balance, continuing to lower expectations, continuing to teach the people around me that I didn't require active choice, only passive allowance. I imagined myself 10 years ahead, still calm, still reliable, still unseen, and I asked myself whether I would respect the man who made that choice. The answer wasn't immediate, but the weight was. A heaviness that felt like signing a long-term agreement with stagnation. Option 2, confront. Name the distance. Demand recalibration. Attempt to renegotiate a dynamic that had been quietly solidifying for years. On the surface, this looked courageous, honest, necessary. But I understood the psychology beneath it. Confrontation at this stage wouldn't come from mutual awareness. It would come from delayed desperation, from wanting to be seen only after learning how invisible you've become. And I knew something else, just as clearly. When you have to ask for respect, you're already negotiating from behind. Any change achieved this way would be reactive, not organic. Temporary, not structural. It might create effort, but not genuine repositioning. Worse, my sudden insistence on space would be read not as growth, but as deviation, as instability, as a problem to manage. I wasn't willing to argue for my relevance in my own marriage. Option 3, leave. Not abruptly, not emotionally, not as an escape, but as a conscious withdrawal from a structure where my presence no longer altered the outcome. What surprised me most was how this option felt. Not terrifying, not heartbreaking, but light. That lightness made me cautious, Major decisions are supposed to feel heavy, but this one felt like setting something down, something I'd been carrying long after it stopped being mine. Still, I waited, not because I doubted the decision, but because I wanted to be sure it wasn't driven by fatigue or temporary clarity. I observed myself across time and states, when calm, when stressed, when hopeful, when detached. Nothing changed. I no longer anticipated connection. I no longer imagined a future version where things worked out. I no longer felt pulled toward repair, and the absence of those impulses didn't make me sad. It made me free. That's when I realized something essential. I had already left emotionally. What remained was form, habit, and appearance. And appearance should never dictate the direction of a life. I asked myself one final question, stripped of romance, morality, and expectation. If nothing changes, if no one grows, apologizes, or suddenly sees me, am I willing to live the rest of my life exactly like this? The answer came instantly. No. Probably not I don't think so, but no. And when an answer arrives that cleanly, you're no longer deciding. You're preparing to honor it. I didn't tell her yet, not because I was afraid, but because I needed this decision to belong to me completely before it encountered anyone else's reaction. Once spoken, it would become a shared event. I needed it first to be a settled truth. I understood that once I moved forward, there would be no return to the old shape of things. And I didn't want any part of me to miss that shape. This wasn't a decision to break something. It was a decision to acknowledge that something had already ended. Breaking is loud, the ending is quiet. And when I finally accepted that ending internally, there was no climax, just the calm certainty that I was stepping into a different chapter of my life, one where I no longer had to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. The path ahead wasn't fully mapped, but the direction was no longer unclear. And without anyone noticing, without conflict, without warning, the most important decision of my marriage had already been made. Once the decision was made internally, everything else became procedural. That's the part people rarely understand. They imagine leaving as an emotional explosion, a breaking point where feelings finally spill over. But when a decision is reached in clarity instead of anger, what follows isn't chaos. It's a quiet execution. I didn't change my behavior outwardly, not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing to announce. I still showed up, still spoke calmly, still fulfilled responsibilities. The difference was subtle, but absolute. I was no longer emotionally negotiating my place. I stopped trying to be understood. That alone frees an enormous amount of energy. I began moving with intention, but without urgency. Urgency comes from fear. I wasn't afraid. I was resolved. Every step I took was measured, reversible only in theory, but permanent in direction. I started with logistics. I reviewed accounts, obligations, and timelines, not obsessively, methodically. I made sure everything was clear, documented, and stable. I wasn't planning an escape. I was preparing a transition. There's a difference. One is reactive. The other is deliberate. At work, I repositioned myself carefully. I strengthened my autonomy, not by demanding recognition, but by choosing projects that didn't tether my future to anyone else's approval. I built optionality, quiet leverage, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes your posture. No one noticed. That was the point. At home, I became even more neutral, not colder, just contained. I didn't offer emotional labor that wasn't requested. I didn't volunteer reassurance. I didn't initiate conversations about us anymore, not as punishment, but as alignment. You don't water a plant you've already decided not to transplant. And still, nothing shifted. There was no sudden concern, no curiosity about my inner world, no question that pierced the surface. My withdrawal blended seamlessly into the existing dynamic, confirming what I already knew. My presence had been additive, not essential. That knowledge didn't hurt. It clarified. Silence protected me during this phase, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of containment. I wasn't hiding information, I was conserving energy. I was letting reality reveal itself without interference. When you stop correcting people, they show you exactly who they think you are. And when you stop compensating, systems reveal whether they were ever balanced to begin with. I made arrangements slowly, timelines that didn't depend on emotional readiness. Decisions that didn't require consensus. I didn't rush because I didn't need relief. I needed coherence. There were moments, small ones, where I could have spoken, where a sentence might have opened a door to discussion, but but I understood something critical. Talking too early would have invited negotiation, and negotiation only makes sense when both parties are invested in the same future. We weren't, so I let the silence do its work. People often think moving in silence is about secrecy. It's not. It's about not diluting clarity with noise. It's about allowing your actions to catch up to your understanding at a pace that keeps you intact. I slept better during that time, not because I was relieved, but because my mind was no longer arguing with itself. There's a unique peace that comes from internal alignment, even when the external world hasn't caught up yet. I wasn't counting days. I wasn't waiting for a sign. I was simply progressing toward a version of my life that didn't require me to be smaller. And the remarkable thing was how invisible that progress was to everyone else. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They surface gradually in the spaces where something used to be and no longer is. At first, nothing looked different. The house ran as usual, schedules stayed intact, conversations remained polite, even efficient. From the outside, the system still worked, but systems are sensitive to pressure changes, and I had quietly removed myself from the parts that held it together. That's when the imbalance began to show. It started with small inconveniences, missed details, decisions that took longer because there was no one smoothing them out in advance. Plans that required follow-up questions because I was no longer anticipating needs before they were voiced. I didn't refuse anything, I simply stopped pre-solving. And for the first time, the absence of my quiet labor became noticeable. She seemed mildly irritated at first, not at me directly, but at the friction. Things that usually just worked suddenly required attention, not conflict, just effort. And effort has a way of exposing assumptions. I watched carefully, without satisfaction or judgment. I noticed how often she paused, expecting me to fill in a gap, how conversations ended with unfinished edges, how tasks lingered longer than before. None of it is catastrophic, but cumulative. The system had relied on my invisibility. At work, something similar happened, but in reverse. Because I had repositioned myself internally, my presence carried more weight. I spoke less, but with intention. I no longer over-explained. I no longer compensated for uncertainty that wasn't mine. And people responded differently, not because I demanded respect, but because I occupied my space fully. The contrast sharpened my understanding. Loss isn't always emotional. Sometimes it's functional. At home, the emotional temperature shifted subtly, not colder, more uncertain. She asked more logistical questions, not about me, but about processes I used to manage silently. The absence of my initiative created a vacuum that couldn't be ignored forever. Still, there was no confrontation. People often assume consequences come with realization, that someone suddenly understands what they've lost. That awareness sparks regret. That's not how it usually works. More often, people feel the effects before they understand the cause. She seemed unsettled, slightly off balance, as if something essential had gone missing, but without a clear label. And because I wasn't reacting emotionally, there was nothing obvious to respond to. I remained calm, present, neutral. That neutrality did more than any argument could have. It removed the narrative of blame. Without tension to push against, the consequences stood on their own. The missing piece wasn't masked by conflict, it was just missing. I noticed moments where she almost asked something deeper, where curiosity flickered, but it never fully formed. Old habits are powerful, and when someone is used to a certain level of emotional accommodation, they don't immediately realize what it costs until it's gone. The consequences continued quietly. Socially, she had to explain things I used to contextualize. Emotionally, she had to sit with uncertainty, which I used to absorb. Practically, she had to manage details I used to handle without comment. None of this was punishment. It was exposure. I didn't feel vindicated watching it happen. I felt confirmed. The dynamic had depended on my unspoken contributions far more than anyone realized, and once removed, the imbalance couldn't be ignored. What struck me most was how no one asked whether I was okay. Not once. That absence of inquiry said everything I needed to know. Consequences don't always teach lessons to the person who caused them. Sometimes they simply validate the person who recognized the pattern early enough to step away with dignity. By then, I wasn't emotionally involved in the outcome. I wasn't waiting for recognition or remorse. I was observing the natural result of a system adjusting to a missing load-bearing element. And the system was struggling, quietly. By the time concern finally surfaced, the window for repair had already closed. That's the cruel irony of quiet endings. They don't announce themselves when there's still time to intervene. They unfold slowly, invisibly, until the realization arrives too late to matter. The first real shift came not as a question about me, but as a question about us, asked cautiously, almost experimentally, as if she were testing whether the ground beneath her feet was still solid. "You've been distant," she said one evening. Not accusing, not emotional, just observant enough to notice the change, late enough that it felt unfamiliar. I looked at her and realized something surprising. I felt no urgency to reassure her. In the past, that sentence would have triggered immediate correction. I would have softened it, explained myself, and taken responsibility for the emotional temperature in the room. I would have rushed to restore equilibrium. This time I didn't. Not because I wanted her to worry, but because the imbalance was finally accurate. I acknowledged her observation calmly. No defensiveness, no denial. And in that moment, I could see the confusion settle in. The absence of emotional resistance left her without a familiar script. There was nothing to push against, nothing to resolve. That's when panic begins, not loudly, but internally. She started paying more attention, asking practical questions more frequently, suggesting shared activities that felt slightly out of character. The efforts were subtle, but noticeable, and they came from a place of uncertainty, not understanding. That distinction matters. Trying to fix something without knowing what broke rarely works. I could sense her recalibrating, attempting to re-engage the version of me she remembered. The flexible one, the accommodating one, the man who would meet her halfway no matter where she stood. But that version no longer existed, not because I was withholding, but because I had outgrown the need to maintain it. The more she leaned in, the clearer it became that the effort was reactive. There was no inquiry into how we got there, no curiosity about what had been missing for so long, just an attempt to restore the previous balance without examining whether it had ever been fair. That's when I knew it was too late. Repair requires mutual awareness. Noticing the distance isn't the same as understanding it. And by the time awareness arrived, my attachment had already dissolved into clarity. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt detached. Her concern didn't create hope, it confirmed timing. There were moments when I could have opened the door, where a long conversation might have reintroduced vulnerability, but vulnerability only works when both people are still invested in the same outcome. I wasn't. I had already accepted the ending internally, and you can't resurrect something once acceptance has replaced longing. The panic became more visible after that, not dramatic, but present. Questions came more often. The tone shifted. There was a subtle urgency beneath the surface, as if she sensed something fundamental was slipping beyond reach. And it was. What she felt was loss, but not yet comprehension. She missed the stability, the ease, the unspoken support. She missed the version of the relationship that functioned smoothly. What she didn't yet grasp was that the smoothness had come at a cost I was no longer willing to pay. You can't fix what you never acknowledged, and you can't repair something after the other person has already made peace with letting it go. By the time she realized something needed saving, I had already stopped needing it to survive. And that's the moment when endings become inevitable, not because someone refuses to try, but because the trying arrives after the leaving is already complete. The conversation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations do. There was no build-up, no raised voices, no list of grievances pulled from years of stored frustration. It happened on an ordinary evening, in a quiet space, with the same calm that had come to define everything else. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She asked if we could talk, not urgently, not emotionally, just carefully. I agreed, and we sat across from each other, not as opponents, but as two people acknowledging that something unnamed had finally reached the surface. She spoke first, about distance, about feeling unsure, about not recognizing me the way she used to. Her words circled the truth without landing on it, and I let her finish without interruption. When it was my turn, I didn't accuse. I didn't catalog moments. I didn't argue history. I didn't raise my voice or harden my tone. I simply stated what was. I told her I had been quiet for a long time, that I had adapted more than I should have, that somewhere along the way, I stopped being an active participant in the relationship and became a background constant, and that I no longer wanted to live that way. There was no heat in my voice, no bitterness, just a fact. That calm made it impossible to dismiss. There was no emotional excess to deflect, no anger to pathologize, no drama to reframe. What I was saying didn't sound like a complaint, it sounded like a conclusion. She tried to explain, to recontextualize, to point to stress, timing, and phases, and I listened, genuinely, but listening didn't mean re-entering negotiation. I told her I believed she never intended to hurt me, and I meant it. Intent wasn't the issue, impact was, and the impact had already shaped my decision. That's when the realization finally landed. Not as guilt, as recognition. She saw that this conversation wasn't an opening, it was a closing, that I wasn't asking for change, I was informing her of alignment. And that frightened her, because there was nothing to bargain with. People are used to conflict being emotional. They know how to respond to anger, to tears, to urgency. But calm certainty removes all leverage. It doesn't invite defense, it demands acceptance. I didn't blame her, I didn't blame myself. I told her the relationship had run its course, quietly, over time. That I wasn't leaving because of a single failure, but because of a long-standing imbalance that no longer matched who I was. The room stayed quiet after that. Not tense, still. She asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I answered honestly, no, because nothing could have helped. But because anything that might have helped would have needed to happen long before now. And we both knew that. The confrontation ended the way it began, without drama, without cruelty, without raised voices or slammed doors. Just two people sitting with the truth that something meaningful had already ended. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to soften the moment. Clarity doesn't require volume. I didn't become someone new after it ended. That's the part that surprises people. There was no reinvention arc, no sudden confidence, no dramatic shedding of skin. I didn't wake up transformed. I woke up unburdened. And that difference is subtle, but everything follows from it. I'm still quiet, still observant, still measured in how I speak and where I place my energy. The difference is that my silence no longer costs me anything. It isn't payment for peace. It isn't a concession. It's a choice I make because it fits who I am, not because it keeps someone else comfortable. I occupy space now without announcing it. That's new. In conversations, I don't rush to fill gaps. I don't soften truths preemptively. I don't carry the emotional temperature of the room on my shoulders. If something matters to me, I say it. If it doesn't, I let it pass. There's no performance in either direction. What changed wasn't my voice, it was my posture. I understand now that being dependable isn't the same as being dispensable. That patience, when it isn't reciprocated, becomes self-erasure. And that calm, when used to avoid discomfort instead of honoring truth, slowly hollows you out. I don't hold bitterness toward her. Not because I'm generous, but because bitterness would mean I'm still negotiating with the past. I'm not. I've integrated it. I see the relationship clearly now for what it was. A long season where two people grew at different speeds and mistook silence for stability. There were good years, real affection, shared effort, and there was also a gradual misalignment that neither of us knew how to name until it was already complete. That doesn't make either of us villains. It makes us human. What I carry forward isn't resentment, it's discernment. I notice early now when my presence becomes optional, when my voice is heard but not considered, when my adaptability is quietly assumed instead of appreciated. And when I notice those patterns, I don't argue with them. I respond. Not dramatically, not defensively, just decisively. I have learned that self-respect doesn't need to be loud to be firm. That leaving doesn't always look like walking away. It can look like standing still long enough to realize you no longer belong where you are. Most importantly, I've learned that intimacy requires curiosity, mutual curiosity, the willingness to notice when someone goes quiet and ask why before the quiet becomes a conclusion. I don't chase connection anymore. I chose it, and if it's not chosen back, I don't shrink to make it work. That's who I am now. Not louder, not harder, just clearer. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to extract a lesson that sounds sharp. Something definitive, something that feels like a warning or a victory. But real endings are rarely that clean. What I learned didn't arrive as a slogan. It settled slowly, through experience. The truth is, nothing in my marriage collapsed. It didn't explode. It didn't betray itself in a single moment. It simply reached a point where one person was still adjusting, still absorbing, still staying quiet, while the other had stopped noticing that quiet at all. And that's how many things end. Not because someone is cruel, not because someone is wrong, but because one person adapts so well that they disappear, and the other confuses that disappearance for stability. Quiet people are often praised for being strong, for being patient, for being low drama. But no one talks enough about the cost of that praise, how easily it becomes permission for others to stop paying attention. What this experience taught me is simple, but not easy. If your presence doesn't change the room, your absence eventually will. And by the time that absence is felt, the person who left has often already made peace with it. I don't regret staying as long as I did. At the time, it was an honest choice. I believed in endurance. I believed in commitment. I believed that patience would be met with awareness. What I regret, if anything, is not noticing sooner that silence can be a signal, not just a virtue. That's when you stop being asked how you feel. Stop being included in the future tense. Stop being noticed. Those aren't small things. They're information. Information about where you stand. And when you finally listen to that information, you don't need revenge. You don't need vindication. You don't even need closure from the other person. You need alignment with yourself. Walking away quietly isn't a weakness. Staying quiet when something matters is. There's a difference. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Pay attention to where you are allowed to exist fully, without shrinking, without explaining, without earning your place over and over again. That's where you belong. And if you're listening to this right now, maybe you see yourself somewhere in this story. Maybe you've been the quiet one, the reliable one, the person who keeps things running while slowly fading into the background. So I'll leave you with one question, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. In your own life, where are you being tolerated instead of truly chosen? If this resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments, your experience, your perspective. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that connect us the most, and sometimes telling them is the first step back into yourself.